So fellas, this one's for all you weebs out there, all of you Japanese culture appreciators. The Japanese are some of the most virtuous people out there, but the question is, why are they not Christians? Why are they not Catholics? And there's a whole history. You have to understand the context of the history. There was a major effort to convert them, but it kind of got snuffed out, but there is a lot of potentiality there. My guess is that going into the 22nd, 23rd centuries, Asia is going to play a larger role in church history. It seems like their time has not yet come. So that's my hope. That's what this video is going to be about. I'm going to be talking about the different history periods, Sengoku era, the Edo period, the Meiji Restoration, the good and bad, the morality of dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's a reason why they picked those cities. Japan's current demographic crisis, and kind of where I see them going into the future. So hit subscribe if you haven't. I hate to be that guy who is always plugging myself, but I'm trying to grow this channel. I'm trying to spread Catholic content, so that's my goal. Anyways, first we have to go back to the Sengoku period, which is the Warring States period. This is during the 15th and 16th centuries. And basically during this era, Japan is splintered into a bunch of kind of factions. Local regional daimyo or kings control local regions, and they're all fighting each other, trying to expand their territories. To give a 1,000-foot overview, there is basically how this plays out is eventually Oda Nobunaga, you may have heard the name, he is able to conquer a lot of Japan, and he unites a lot of people together. He dies. This guy named Toyotomi Hideyoshi takes control, and he basically conquers almost the rest of Japan, and then he goes and tries to invade Korea, fails, he dies, and then Ieyasu Tokugawa basically takes control, and he establishes a new dynasty called the Tokugawa dynasty, which rules for the next era. During this era is also when the Jesuits, the Catholic Jesuits, came to Japan, and St. Francis Xavier landed in kind of the Nagasaki area, which is the southwestern little tip of Japan during this era, and he starts dialoguing and converting some of the local daimyo and many of the people in Nagasaki and Hiroshima area. And there is a series of people of martyrs and blesseds during this era as well. At first, people are receptive to the Catholics, but then they become suspicious, specifically Hideyoshi. He bans the Jesuits from the countries because the Jesuits are beginning to become a threat, because Christianity is becoming very influential throughout the country. He bans the Jesuits from the country, and then Tokugawa fully bans Christianity, and that's when the actual martyrdoms and exiles start happening. This is the era when the movie Silence happens by Martin Scorsese. It was actually ran by this Japanese Catholic in the 1960s, Shusaku Endo, and Scorsese is kind of an atheistic dude. He kind of emphasizes the defeatism of how the Jesuits failed to hold on to the faith. Many of them defected and fell away, and that's what kind of the movie Silence is about. It's good to know because it gives you a gateway into that era of history, but I don't think it's kind of like oh yes, the Catholics failed, kind of emphasizing that too much. St. Francis Xavier, he was able to bring Western tech to Japan also, which is why during the Sengoku, that's when they started fighting with gunpowder and rifles. He brought a lot of Western stuff, which is why a lot of the daimyo liked him. And there were some major daimyo who were converted, and they sacrificed for the faith, including Blessed Takayama Ukon, who he was actually beatified. He's a blessed in 2017 by Pope Francis, and he was a Catholic samurai for Christ. He became a devout Catholic. He was a noble, and he fought under Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, and then he was eventually exiled under Tokugawa because he refused to get rid of his faith. He was a Christian, and he basically lost all his power, all his status that he had accumulated. He was throughout his whole life. In order to keep the faith, they didn't they didn't execute him because he was a samurai class. But yes, there was people who died. There's a bunch of saints in this era, and people don't know about this area. So the Tokugawa, they take over and they persecute and martyr many people. The church goes underground during the next era, which is the Edo period, from 1603 to 1857. And the church is underground for like 250 years. They were able to successfully get rid of all the Jesuits, all the priests. And so the church is still continues on, even though there's no priest. Still primarily kind of in this same region where the Jesuits originally landed. They have kind of these idols that they're like, oh yes, these are Buddhist or Shinto idols, but actually they were statues of Mary and Jesus. And they kept the faith for 250 years. I think that's the real takeaway from this period, is that they were able to endure underground in the same way that the early church was able to endure the Roman persecutions for 250 years. During this era, the Tokugawa shogunate, the way it was structured was, there's the shogun on top, there's the samurai, then there's the peasants, and then there's the artisans and craftsmen, and then there's the merchants, and then there's the outcasts below them. So it's a very strict hierarchy. They close the borders, and this area is also what the Wano arc from One Piece is based off of. They close up the borders, and during this era there is a time of peace, but then things kind of gradually become corrupt, as is the case in many empires. And basically what happens is the merchant class becomes too powerful, and the samurai class become too diminished, and everyone just basically becomes degenerates. And there's kind of a faction that is in favor of the emperor regaining power, because during this time the shogun was the real ruler and the emperor is just kind of a figurehead. But what really takes things to a boiling point, so there's all this underlying pressure, but then Admiral Perry from the US comes in the 1850s with some giant battleships that are just far more powerful, and they're like, hey, you guys need to open up your borders, that way US, Britain, and Russia can start trading with you guys. And the Tokugawa shogunate is really concerned because they are outclassed, they are behind technologically compared to the Europeans, and so they basically concede. But there's some people in the Tokugawa, in certain provinces, who are really angry at this point with the Tokugawa, and they overthrow the dynasty, the shogunate, and reestablish the emperor as kind of being the primary powerful person. And this is when the Meiji Restoration happens. They adopt and absorb a lot of the Western technology and systems, and they create like a very Western kind of democracy. The emperor was, but they basically absorb a lot of the Western ideas, good and bad. And this is when Japan starts becoming like extremely aggressive. This is why Japan was so off the wall during World War II, World War I, because they basically copied the British and the Americans, and they really loved imitating also Germany and Prussia during this era. If you haven't noticed, Japanese people are obsessed with Germany, and they really like Germany, even though it doesn't have to do necessarily with World War II and that alliance, but they just in general really like Germany. And this is when they start also absorbing some of the bad Western ideas, like the modernism ideas, like Enlightenment values, in the Industrial Revolution values, capitalism, and the concept of nationalism. And they also start getting that Anglo grind set during this era, because they're copying a lot of the Protestant Western capitalist viewpoints. And so that's why they become so imperialistic and aggressive, and they are kind of successful in basically being mini Britain for a while. Like, they actually defeat Russia in a war over Korea, and they invade China like twice, and they also invade some islands during World War I and take some islands from the Germans. They were pretty warlike people, so they were effective in terms of warfare. So but then when it comes to World War II, you guys know the story, and I'm going to talk about why was the bomb not justified. So there's the moral and the pragmatic side to this. So pragmatically, the narrative goes, oh, well, the Japanese, they would have fought to the last man. They would have basically never given up, never surrendered. So the U.S. would have completely wiped them out to the last man. Therefore, by dropping the bombs on Japan, we actually saved more lives. This is a utilitarian viewpoint, and we as Catholics cannot believe in this. And it's also not true. Given what people during that era were actually saying, the decision came to Harry Truman on which cities to drop the bomb on, but whether or not we should or not as well. And General Dwight Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur, many of these people were against dropping the bomb from a practical perspective. So it's kind of a lie that we're told as Americans that it's like that was the only option really to drop the bomb. There was other reasons like, oh, we want to demonstrate to Russia that we have the nuke and that we can use it. And then there's the moral kind of viewpoints, which so during this point, Japan was pretty much finished. Most of their aircraft carriers had been wiped out. Tokyo had been firebombed already. You should watch the Studio Ghibli movie Grave of the Fireflies, which talks about that. It's a pretty sad movie, not gonna lie. But the problem with dropping the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima was that they weren't actually main industrial military cities compared to some of the other ones, but they were cities that had the highest density of Catholics. Because during the Meiji Restoration, many of the Catholics were able to reemerge from being underground, and Catholicism was growing, especially in those regions. And so Hiroshima and Nagasaki were like the most Catholic cities, basically. So Truman, I think he chose those two cities for a reason. There's a miracle that happened in Hiroshima, where there was 4 Jesuits in a church basically at ground zero, right below where the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima, and they all survived with only a few minor injuries, and none of them died of radiation poisoning, even though many people far way out there died. So it was a miracle, and people don't know about that story. Another thing that people don't know about is how St. Maximilian Kolby, before he died in Auschwitz, he was active in Japan in the 1920s, and he built like a center devoted towards Mary and Our Lady outside of Nagasaki, which was far away from the city where it actually wasn't even affected by the nuke. So that was kind of like miraculous to some degree. So the bomb was not justified, in my viewpoint. They specifically chose those cities, which were mostly civilians, and they killed like 200,000 Catholics, innocent civilians, using the atomic bombs. So it's really sad what happened there, but I think that there's also a book called A Song for Nagasaki by Takashi Nagai, who is considered like a Japanese national hero, and he was he got cancer because he was partially nuked. He was far away enough that he didn't die, but he was bedridden because he got cancer from the radiation, and he kind of wrote from a Catholic perspective on the bombing of Nagasaki, and how basically the bombing of Nagasaki, he frames it as Nagasaki was the sacrificial lamb for ending the war in the same way that Christ died for our sins. And so that's a very good book to read. There's also the confirmed Marian apparition of Our Lady of Akita, which happened in the 80s, I think 70s or 80s, where basically Our Lady appeared and told Sister Agnes, I believe, she was a nun, basically in the region of Akita, to pray the rosary, that way to avert crisis for humanity. So, and there was a miraculous statue where there's some miracles that happened associated with that apparition, where the statue was like crying tears of Mary. And even St. Francis Xavier mentioned that when he was trying to introduce the Japanese people to Christ, they were less receptive when he didn't have Our Lady also displayed with the icon of Christ. So Our Lady is very intertwined with Japan. She's appeared there. And I think going into the future, that narrative is going to continue. So Japan, they lose in the war and they are reconstructed by America, and they start becoming hyper anglicized in a way, like hyper capitalism. Everything becomes about work culture and grind sets in a way. And one thing to understand about the difference between the Westerns and the Easterns is that the Easterns, they prioritize social harmony and cohesion over the Westerns, who are more independent. The reason why is because the West, the Europeans, it's scattered with coastlines, and it's also kind of built, the Roman Empire was built around the Mediterranean Sea. And so when you're seafaring, you're going to be more independent than if you're kind of on an island like Japan, where social harmony matters more. There's only a few big valleys in Japan geographically where you can build big cities, the rest is mountains. So you have to kind of get along with your neighbors more because you're limited in the space that you're at. And so that's why Eastern people, they care more about social harmony and social cohesion. Even the yin and yang symbol, they're okay with duality more, they're okay with contradictions more, whereas the Europeans are more objectivist and individualistic. So that's kind of one of the reasons why them accepting kind of these Western modern ideals, which are causing problems, is so disastrous, because they don't want to disrupt social harmony by being against these widely accepted consensus ideas, which are basically the modern work culture, women being career women, not starting families, that kind of thing. They're more kind of hive-mindy, like they're more ant-like, the Asians, and there's a lot of virtue that comes with it. Like they have very low crime in those cities compared to the West. But the problem is that they are also having trouble breaking out of the bad ideas from the West that they absorbed. And so, currently in Japan, there's only 1% Catholics, and most of them are concentrated again in the Nagasaki, Hiroshima area. And they have insane work culture where they are just like, they're grinding hard all the time. A lot of people are not starting families, which is why their birth rates plummeted so hard, and why they are going to be strongly diminished in this century, because no one's having kids, no one's starting family, and that's the foundation. They are more focused on career and just working hard at the expense of community, and they actually have good community, but at the expense of having families, basically. So, the prime minister even recently said that there's society is going to cease to function well due to them not having enough kids. So they are kind of victims of modernity, just like the rest of the world, because they absorb the Western ideals, because the West won in all these military capacities in the past. So the things that are going to play out here in the church in this century, traditionalism versus modernism, it's going to cascade eventually and affect Japan eventually as well. I think they are some of the most naturally virtuous people on earth. They would probably make some of the best Christians. They have so much potential in terms of, they have so much to offer as a people. So I think there's a lot of potential there. Another thing that could happen, E. Michael Jones suggested this, is to basically allow Filipinos to immigrate to Japan who are Catholics, and that would help with the demographic crisis, and that would also introduce more Catholicism into Japan. So that could be a good solution. I know the neo-pagans who are all about racial purity are against that. The ethno-nationalists are like, oh, it's better to have fewer people but be racially pure. The Catholics don't necessarily agree with that. So my intuition is that Japan is going to go through some pain. China, the same demographic collapse that's affecting Japan is affecting the rest of the world too, just that it's hitting them sooner. Korea also, China also, Russia, like the whole world is going through demographic decline, and it's because of the modern ideology that we have. So as this modern ideology gets overturned eventually, then things will kind of reset. But for now, things are kind of looking ugly in the short term. There's so much potential there. I think Our Lady is going to do something there, and the Immaculate Heart of Mary is going to prevail in the world, and the seeds of Mary being prevalent in the Islamic world, in the Asian world, and the African world are all there. So I think there's going to be a blossoming into the next Christendom, the next Christian era, and the seeds are already dormant there within Japan and China. For now, we just gotta do what we can with where we're at in our own individual lives, but I see so much potential there. The seeds. We have to understand the history to be able to see the future. God has a plan ultimately. I hope you guys like this. Leave a comment and subscribe, leave a like. I appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.